For generations, the family doctor represented something rare, a profession built on trust. Patients welcomed their physician into their homes during life's most difficult moments. They trusted their advice, accepted their diagnoses, and believed that every decision was made with compassion and care. In Britain, few relationships carried greater confidence than that between a general practitioner and the communities they served. But in the late 1990s, investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that one respected physician had betrayed that trust on an unprecedented scale. At first, there were only small concerns, an unusually high number of death certificates, questions surrounding cremation forms, a few professionals quietly wondering whether the numbers added up. Nothing that clearly pointed toward a crime, nothing that could immediately explain what they were seeing. Then one family's determination to seek answers transformed everything. What began as a routine investigation would become one of the largest criminal inquiries in British medical history. It would expose weaknesses in death certification, reveal shortcomings in investigative procedures, lead to sweeping reforms throughout the National Health Service, and forever change how physicians, coroners, forensic investigators, and law enforcement agencies work together. This is not simply the story of one doctor. It is the story of how investigators uncovered a pattern hidden in plain sight. How forensic science, persistence, and careful evidence gathering exposed one of the most significant breaches of public trust in modern British history. Most importantly, it is the story of how an entire healthcare system learned from tragedy and transformed itself to better protect future generations. This is the Criminalist Files. Every major investigation has a beginning. Rarely does it begin with flashing lights, dramatic arrests, or a single breakthrough that changes everything
Morning,
overnight.
Sarah.
More often,
Good morning,
it
Arthur.
begins with a question, a statistic that doesn't quite fit, a document that seems unusual, a professional who notices something others have overlooked. The investigation that ultimately exposed Harold Shipman followed that familiar path. There was no anonymous tip identifying a suspect. There was no witness who immediately connected dozens of deaths. Instead, investigators slowly discovered that what appeared to be isolated events might actually represent part of a much larger pattern. To understand how that realization occurred, it's important to understand the role of a British general practitioner during the 1980s and 1990s. Family doctors occupied a unique position within their communities. Unlike hospital physicians, general practitioners often cared for the same families over many years. They treated childhood illnesses, monitored chronic diseases, visited patients in their homes, and frequently became trusted figures across multiple generations. That trust formed one of the greatest strengths of Britain's healthcare system. It also meant that a physician's professional judgment was rarely questioned without substantial evidence. When an elderly patient died at home after years of medical care, the death was often viewed as a natural conclusion rather than the beginning of a criminal investigation. That assumption shaped countless routine procedures throughout the country. Death certificates were completed. Funeral arrangements moved forward. Families mourned. Life continued. Most of the time, those procedures worked exactly as intended. But investigators would later discover that any system built on trust must also contain safeguards capable of identifying the rare occasions when something is wrong. According to the source material, concerns first reached a formal level during March 1998. Dr. Linda Reynolds, another general practitioner working in Hyde, became increasingly uneasy about the unusually high number of deaths occurring among patients under Shipman's care. She was particularly concerned by the number of cremation forms requiring her counter-signature and believed the pattern deserved closer examination. Rather than making public accusations, Reynolds followed established professional channels. She raised her concerns with John Pollard, the coroner responsible for South Manchester. That decision demonstrated an important principle within professional practice. When experienced professionals identify unusual patterns, they are expected to report concerns through appropriate investigative processes rather than relying upon speculation. The information eventually reached Greater Manchester Police. At that point, investigators faced a difficult challenge. Suspicion alone cannot justify criminal charges. Investigators require evidence, objective evidence. Evidence capable of surviving judicial scrutiny. The initial inquiry therefore focused on determining whether available records supported the concerns that had been raised. According to the uploaded source, investigators concluded that there was insufficient evidence to proceed further, and the investigation was closed in April 1998. Looking back, it is easy to ask why the warning signs were not recognized sooner. But hindsight often reveals patterns that are far less obvious in real time. Detectives rarely know they are investigating a historic case while it is unfolding. Instead, they work with incomplete information. Witnesses remember different details. Medical records require interpretation. Statistics may suggest unusual trends without proving criminal conduct. Professional investigators must distinguish coincidence from evidence. That distinction protects innocent people while ensuring that genuine crimes are supported by reliable facts. The official Shipman inquiry would later examine this first investigation in considerable detail. Its findings concluded that important opportunities had been missed and criticized aspects of the initial police response, including the experience level assigned to the investigation. One of the inquiry's lasting contributions was not merely identifying what happened. It sought to understand why experienced institutions failed to recognize an emerging pattern. Those lessons would ultimately shape reforms reaching far beyond a single criminal case. As the first inquiry ended, life in Hyde appeared to return to normal. Doctors continued seeing patients, families attended appointments, community routines remained unchanged. Yet beneath that appearance of normality, the concerns had not disappeared. In fact, additional observations would soon emerge from an unexpected source. Not another physician, not a forensic scientist, but someone whose profession placed him in daily contact with the people of the community. Taxi driver John Shaw had spent years transporting elderly passengers to appointments throughout Hyde. Unlike investigators who examined files, Shaw observed everyday life. He greeted familiar faces. He remembered conversations. He noticed who returned home and who did not. Over time, he became troubled by the number of passengers who seemed relatively healthy during their journeys, but later died after receiving care from the same physician. His observations were informal. They were not scientific, but they reflected something investigators often value greatly: independent witnesses noticing the same pattern from entirely different perspectives. Shaw reported his concerns to police. His information alone did not solve the investigation. However, combined with the earlier professional concerns, it added another independent voice, suggesting that the deaths deserved renewed examination. Criminal investigations frequently progress in this way. Rarely does one witness provide every answer. Instead, multiple observations gradually reinforce one another until investigators recognize that a broader review is necessary. Patterns become visible only after numerous individual pieces are assembled. Each observation strengthens the next. Each document provides context. Each interview fills another gap. By the summer of 1998, investigators were approaching exactly that point. The pieces were beginning to align. They still lacked a complete picture, but they now had sufficient reason to look more closely. The investigation was about to enter an entirely different phase, one driven not by suspicion alone, but by forensic examination, documentary evidence, and careful reconstruction of events. That next stage would ultimately transform a local inquiry into one of the most significant investigations in British medical history. By the time Harold Shipman's criminal trial concluded in January 2000, one question remained unanswered. How had a trusted physician been able to practice for decades without earlier intervention? For investigators, prosecutors, and government officials, obtaining convictions was only part of the process. Equally important was understanding whether weaknesses within existing systems had delayed the discovery of the pattern. That question led to one of the most extensive public inquiries ever conducted into British medical practice. Known simply as the Shipman Inquiry, the investigation was chaired by Dame Janet Smith and examined not only the criminal case itself, but also the wider systems of medical oversight, death certification, and professional accountability. Rather than focusing on a single prosecution, the inquiry sought to determine whether institutional changes could better protect patients in the future. The inquiry reviewed hundreds of deaths certified during Shipman's medical career. Investigators examined patient records, prescription histories, death certificates, cremation documentation, and witness testimony in an effort to establish a comprehensive understanding of events over nearly 3 decades of medical practice. According to the uploaded source, the inquiry concluded that Shipman had killed at least 218 patients and suggested the total could have been significantly higher, while acknowledging that some cases could not be determined with certainty because of limited evidence. One of the inquiry's defining characteristics was its methodical approach. Rather than relying on assumptions, investigators evaluated each case individually before comparing findings across multiple records. Medical documentation was reviewed alongside prescribing information, certification records, and independent forensic evidence. This reflected an important principle of modern investigation. Patterns become reliable only when supported by multiple independent sources. The inquiry also examined the role of professional oversight. Questions were raised about how concerns had been reported, how they were evaluated, and whether existing procedures provided sufficient opportunities for unusual patterns to be recognized at an earlier stage. The objective was not simply to identify mistakes, it was to understand why those mistakes occurred and how future investigators, physicians, and regulators could avoid repeating them. One area receiving particular attention involved death certification. At the time, the procedures surrounding certification and cremation documentation relied heavily upon professional trust. The inquiry recommended changes intended to strengthen independent review and improve the transparency of the certification process. These recommendations ultimately influenced reforms in the way deaths were documented and reviewed throughout England and Wales. Another important subject involved prescribing practices. The inquiry prompted broader discussion within the medical profession regarding controlled medications, record-keeping, and accountability. While effective pain management remained an essential part of patient care, many physicians reported becoming more cautious when prescribing certain medications following the inquiry, a phenomenon that later became known as the Shipman effect. The uploaded source notes that some commentators express concern that increased caution may also have contributed to underprescribing pain relief for some patients. The inquiry also influenced the work of professional regulators. The General Medical Council reviewed the conduct of physicians involved in certification procedures, while the inquiry recommended broader structural changes intended to strengthen medical regulation and professional accountability. These discussions extended beyond one individual and focused on improving systems that affected patients throughout the United Kingdom. For investigators, the inquiry reinforced the importance of multidisciplinary collaboration. Detectives, forensic scientists, pathologists, statisticians, medical experts, and legal professionals each contributed different forms of expertise. No single discipline could answer every question. Instead, the inquiry demonstrated how complex investigations depend upon cooperation across multiple professions, each applying its own standards of evidence and scientific review. Another lesson involved the value of statistical analysis. The uploaded source references later academic research suggesting that mortality monitoring might have identified unusual patterns several years before suspicions were formally raised. While statistical indicators alone cannot establish criminal conduct, they can serve as an early warning system that prompts closer review when unexpected trends appear. Beyond the courtroom and the inquiry, the case also left a lasting impact on public confidence. For many patients, family doctors continued to represent compassion, professionalism, and trusted medical care. The reforms that followed were designed not to weaken that trust, but to reinforce it by ensuring that healthcare systems included stronger safeguards, clearer oversight, and more transparent procedures. The inquiry's recommendations ultimately reached far beyond one investigation. They influenced death certification practices, professional regulation, medical record keeping, controlled prescribing, and the relationship between healthcare providers, coroners, investigators, and regulatory authorities. Perhaps the inquiry's greatest legacy is not found in any single report. It is found in the principle that every major investigation should leave institutions stronger than they were before. The goal of public inquiry is not simply to examine the past, it is to improve the future. For British medicine, the Shipman inquiry became an opportunity to strengthen professional oversight while preserving the trust that remains central to the relationship between doctors and their patients. Its recommendations continue to influence healthcare policy, investigative procedures, and medical governance decades later. That enduring institutional legacy remains one of the most significant outcomes documented in the source material. Every criminal investigation depends upon evidence. In complex investigations involving healthcare professionals, that evidence often extends far beyond the traditional crime scene. Medical records, prescription histories, death certificates, toxicology reports, and digital documentation all become important sources of information. According to the uploaded source, investigators gradually shifted from examining individual incidents to reviewing broader patterns across multiple cases. Rather than relying on a single event, they compared independent records collected over several years. This approach reflects a fundamental principle of forensic investigation. A single observation may raise a question. Multiple independent observations, examined together, can reveal a pattern worthy of further investigation. Reviewing medical documentation. One of the most significant aspects of the investigation involved reviewing medical records alongside official documentation. Investigators compared patient histories, treatment notes, prescription records, and death certification documents to determine whether the available records consistently reflected the medical circumstances surrounding each death. The uploaded source explains that investigators also examined computerized medical records and discovered that certain entries relating to one patient had been created after the patient's death rather than during treatment. That finding demonstrated how electronic timestamps could assist investigators in reconstructing the sequence in which records were created. Digital documentation became an important investigative tool because computer systems often preserve information about when records are entered or modified. Rather than replacing traditional investigative methods, these electronic records supplemented witness interviews, physical evidence, and laboratory findings. Forensic toxicology. The investigation also relied upon forensic pathology and toxicology. According to the uploaded source, post-mortem examination identified the presence of diamorphine during the review of Kathleen Grundy's death. Laboratory testing formed part of the evidence considered during the investigation. Forensic toxicology is a scientific discipline that examines biological samples to identify medications, chemicals, or other substances that may help investigators understand the circumstances surrounding a death. Laboratories follow standardized analytical procedures designed to ensure that scientific findings are accurate, repeatable, and properly documented. Every laboratory report becomes only one component of a larger investigative process. Scientific evidence is evaluated alongside witness testimony, documentary records, and other independently verified findings. Investigators also examined documentary evidence beyond medical files. According to the source, searchers recovered a typewriter believed to be consistent with the one used to prepare a disputed will. Documentary evidence such as typed documents, signatures, and administrative records became part of the broader evidentiary review. Modern investigations frequently involve specialists trained in question document examination. These experts compare typing characteristics, printing methods, paper, ink, handwriting, and other physical characteristics to determine whether documents are authentic or have been altered. Although documentary evidence rarely determines an investigation by itself, it can provide important corroboration when evaluated alongside other evidence. The uploaded source explains that investigators reviewed 15 specimen cases in detail, while also examining other deaths certified during the physician's practice. Investigators compared multiple categories of information rather than relying upon isolated incidents. This type of comparative review is common in large investigations. Independent files are evaluated using consistent criteria: dates, locations, medical histories, prescription information, certification records, witness statements. When multiple independent sources begin revealing similar characteristics, investigators gain greater confidence that further examination is warranted. Pattern analysis does not replace individual case review. Instead, it helps investigators identify questions requiring additional scientific investigation. Several years after the criminal proceedings, researchers examined mortality data to determine whether statistical monitoring might have identified unusual trends earlier. According to the uploaded source, a 2003 study led by statistician David Spiegelhalter concluded that mortality rates appeared to increase after 1995 and suggested that statistical monitoring might have raised concerns before formal suspicions emerged, although not early enough to prevent many excess deaths. Statistical analysis provides investigators with an additional tool. It does not establish criminal conduct. Instead, it highlights unexpected patterns that deserve professional review. Healthcare organizations routinely use similar methods today to monitor patient outcomes, identify unusual trends, and support quality improvement initiatives. The investigation described in the uploaded source illustrates how modern criminal investigations depend upon cooperation between multiple professional disciplines. Police investigators gathered documentary evidence. Forensic scientists analyzed laboratory findings. Medical experts interpreted clinical records. Pathologists conducted post-mortem examinations. Statisticians evaluated long-term mortality data. Legal professionals assessed whether the available evidence satisfied criminal standards. Each discipline answered different questions. Together, they produced a more complete understanding than any single profession could achieve independently. One of the most important lessons arising from the forensic review is the value of systematic documentation. Reliable investigations depend upon carefully maintained records, standardized laboratory procedures, secure evidence handling, and independent verification. Scientific findings become most valuable when they can be reproduced, reviewed, and explained clearly within the judicial process. The uploaded source also emphasizes that later reviews led to broader discussions regarding mortality monitoring, professional oversight, death certification, and healthcare governance. These developments illustrate how complex investigations often contribute to improvements extending well beyond the original case. As the criminal investigation progressed, attention shifted from determining whether sufficient evidence existed to support an arrest to preparing that evidence for judicial review. In any major criminal case, investigators must organize scientific findings, documentary evidence, witness testimony, and expert analysis into a form that can be evaluated through the court process. According to the uploaded source, the prosecution presented evidence relating to 15 representative cases, sometimes referred to as specimen cases, together with evidence concerning the alleged forgery of Kathleen Grundy's will. The trial began at Preston Crown Court in October 1999. From an investigative perspective, selecting representative cases serves a practical purpose. Large investigations may involve extensive records accumulated over many years. Prosecutors must decide which evidence can most clearly demonstrate the issues before the court while remaining manageable for judicial proceedings. The evidence described in the source came from several independent disciplines. Medical documentation provided information regarding patient care and recorded clinical observations. Forensic pathology and toxicology contributed scientific findings from post-mortem examinations. Digital evidence included computerized medical records that investigators examined as part of reconstructing the sequence of events. Document examination became relevant where questions arose regarding the authenticity of written records. Witness testimony provided context regarding professional practice and investigative timelines. Rather than relying on a single source, the investigation combined multiple forms of evidence that could be evaluated together. One important lesson illustrated by the source is the role of corroboration. Investigators do not normally rely upon one document, one witness, or one laboratory result in isolation. Instead, they compare independent sources to determine whether they support one another. When documentary evidence, forensic science, witness testimony, and digital records all point toward the same conclusion, confidence in the overall evidentiary picture increases. This principle remains central to modern criminal investigations. The uploaded source also highlights the importance of digital evidence. Computerized medical records preserved information that investigators examined alongside other documentation. Electronic timestamps and record histories became part of the evidentiary review, illustrating how digital systems can assist investigators in reconstructing chronology. Digital evidence is now a routine feature of many investigations. Electronic records, audit logs, and secure documentation systems help establish when information was created, modified, or accessed. However, digital evidence must be preserved according to accepted forensic procedures so that its integrity can later be demonstrated in court. Another major theme emerging from the source is the importance of expert witnesses. Complex criminal proceedings often involve scientific subjects outside ordinary experience. Pathologists explain medical findings. Forensic scientists describe laboratory methods. Digital forensic specialists explain electronic evidence. Their purpose is to help the court understand technical information rather than to determine guilt or innocence. This collaborative approach allows judges and juries to evaluate evidence using clearly explained scientific principles. The uploaded material also describes actions taken after the conviction. The General Medical Council removed the physician from the medical register, and subsequent reviews examined professional conduct associated with certification procedures. The source notes that recommendations from the Shipman inquiry contributed to later changes in the structure of the General Medical Council and broader systems of professional oversight. One of the most significant institutional outcomes involved death certification. The source explains that procedures associated with certification and cremation documentation were revised following the inquiry. Additional questions and safeguards were introduced to strengthen review processes and improve transparency. These reforms were intended to reduce opportunities for unusual patterns to remain undetected while preserving confidence in the healthcare system. The investigation also influenced prescribing practice. According to the uploaded source, many physicians became more cautious when prescribing controlled pain medications, a phenomenon later referred to as the Shipman effect. While increased oversight strengthened accountability, the source also notes concerns expressed by some commentators that excessive caution could contribute to underprescribing pain relief for patients who genuinely required it. Another lasting lesson concerns quality assurance. Modern healthcare organizations increasingly use mortality review programs, prescribing audits, clinical governance, and multidisciplinary review processes to identify unexpected trends. These systems are not designed to replace professional judgment, but to provide additional opportunities for unusual patterns to be recognized and evaluated appropriately. Taken together, the uploaded source presents an important institutional lesson. The long-term significance of the investigation lies not only in the judicial outcome, but also in the reforms that followed. Improvements to professional oversight, evidence review, digital documentation, regulatory accountability, and healthcare governance demonstrate how major investigations can strengthen public institutions. For investigators, clinicians, regulators, and policymakers alike, the enduring message is clear. Effective systems depend upon careful documentation, independent review, scientific rigor, and continuous evaluation. Those principles remain fundamental to both criminal investigation and modern healthcare administration. Every major criminal investigation eventually reaches a point where the work of detectives transitions to the work of the courts. By the conclusion of the investigation, British authorities had assembled evidence from forensic examinations, digital medical records, documentary analysis, witness testimony, and expert opinion. Rather than relying on any single piece of evidence, prosecutors presented multiple, independent sources that supported the findings placed before the jury. The criminal trial concluded on January 31, 2000, when the jury returned guilty verdicts on 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery after 6 days of deliberation. The court imposed life imprisonment with a whole life tariff, reflecting the seriousness of the offences before it. Shortly afterward, the General Medical Council, GMC, removed the physician from the medical register, ending his ability to practice medicine permanently. Although investigators believed additional cases warranted examination, prosecutors decided not to pursue further criminal charges. According to the uploaded source, they concluded that the extensive publicity surrounding the original proceedings would make additional trials difficult to conduct fairly, and that the sentences already imposed rendered further litigation unnecessary. For many families, however, the criminal convictions did not answer every question. They wanted to understand how concerns had remained unresolved for so long. Those questions became the foundation of a broader public examination. The Shipman inquiry, chaired by Dame Janet Smith, reviewed deaths certified over many years, examined investigative procedures, and evaluated how medical oversight operated before concerns were formally recognized. According to the inquiry summarized in the source, it concluded that at least 218 deaths were attributable to unlawful killings, while noting that evidence for additional cases was insufficient to reach definitive conclusions. The inquiry estimated a possible total of around 250 victims over a 27-year period. One of the inquiry's most significant achievements was shifting attention from a single criminal case to the systems intended to protect patients. Investigators examined how death certificates were completed, how cremation documentation was reviewed, how professional concerns were reported, how police investigations were initiated, and how communication between healthcare organizations and regulatory bodies could be improved. The objective was not only to understand what had happened, but also to strengthen the institutions responsible for preventing similar failures in the future. The inquiry also reviewed professional accountability. The uploaded source notes that the GMC considered the actions of physicians involved in certification procedures. While 6 doctors who had countersigned cremation forms were ultimately found not guilty of misconduct, 2 doctors associated with earlier concerns were later found guilty of serious professional misconduct for failing to report concerns and for providing misleading evidence during the inquiry. The inquiry also recommended structural reforms to the General Medical Council itself. These findings demonstrated that accountability extends beyond criminal prosecution. Professional regulation, institutional review, and transparent oversight all contribute to maintaining public confidence in healthcare. The source further explains that the investigation continued to address practical matters after the inquiry. Police reviewed property seized during the investigation and worked with families to identify personal belongings. Items that could be positively identified were returned where possible, while proceeds from the auction of unclaimed property were directed to victim support services. Communities also sought appropriate ways to remember those who had lost their lives. In 2005, the Garden of Tranquility was opened in Hyde Park as a memorial dedicated to the victims. Rather than focusing attention on the offender, the memorial recognized the individuals, families, and community affected by the investigation. The source also notes that years later, many families continued to seek compensation and closure. Perhaps the most enduring legacy described in the uploaded material is what became known as the Shipman effect. Healthcare professionals reported becoming more cautious in their prescribing practices, particularly regarding controlled medications. Death certification procedures were revised, including changes to the questions required during cremation documentation, in an effort to strengthen independent review and improve transparency. These reforms reflected a broader principle. Healthcare systems must continually evaluate their own procedures, medical records, professional oversight, mortality review, clinical governance, prescribing audits, digital documentation. None of these measures alone can prevent every failure. Together, however, they create multiple opportunities to recognize unusual patterns before they become systemic problems. The investigation also influenced criminal investigation more broadly. It demonstrated the growing importance of multidisciplinary teams that combine detectives, forensic scientists, pathologists, statisticians, digital forensic specialists, and legal professionals. Modern investigations increasingly depend upon collaboration across these disciplines, with each contributing different expertise while working toward a common objective. Looking back today, the lasting significance of this investigation is not measured solely by its criminal convictions. Its greater contribution lies in the institutional reforms that followed. Changes to medical oversight, improved regulatory accountability, enhanced death certification, more systematic mortality review, greater use of digital records, and stronger collaboration between healthcare professionals and law enforcement. These developments illustrate an important lesson shared by many major public inquiries. Justice is not only about determining responsibility for past events, it is also about learning from those events to improve the systems that protect future generations. That remains the enduring legacy documented throughout the uploaded source.